Linda Barrett had always believed that love was best shown through actions. She had never been one for big speeches, dramatic gestures, or flowery declarations. In her 68 years, she had learned, sometimes painfully, that words could be sweet as honey one day and turn bitter the next. Actions, on the other hand, left footprints that time couldn't erase. That's what made them real. For more than 3 decades, her footprints had been firmly planted in the life of her only child, Melissa. From the moment she held that tiny, squirming bundle in her arms, Linda had promised herself she would be there, always. And she had been. Through late nights at the kitchen table helping with school projects, through awkward teenage heartbreaks soothed with ice cream, through the proud tears at college graduation, Linda had shown up. Now, Melissa was getting married. The news had come on a warm spring afternoon, the kind where the Oregon sun peeked through just enough to remind you winter wouldn't last forever. Linda had been trimming roses behind her flower shop when Melissa appeared, a glinting diamond catching the light on her left hand. The younger woman's smile was wide, almost childlike. "Daniel proposed," Melissa said, voice trembling with excitement. "I said yes." Linda pulled off her gardening gloves, her heart swelling. Daniel Brooks had seemed like a decent man, polite, well-dressed, maybe a little too reserved, but kind enough. Linda had met his family only twice, and while Patricia Brooks, Daniel's mother, carried herself with a kind of poise that spoke of old money, she had kept the conversation civil, if not exactly warm. That evening, Linda poured herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the small oak desk in her living room. She opened the worn leather notebook she used for important matters. Her mind was already racing with ideas for the wedding. As a florist, she knew the best seasonal blooms, the venues that took your breath away, the bands that could keep people dancing until midnight. She began making a list. Venue, Coastal California estate. Dress, custom, something timeless. Florist, her own shop, of course, but with a full team working the event. Photographer, caterer, entertainment, and why not the honeymoon? 2 weeks in Hawaii, in one of those overwater villas that looked like they floated in paradise. When she added up the numbers, the total came to $60,000. Almost every cent she had managed to save outside her modest retirement account. But Linda didn't hesitate. This was her gift. Not just to Melissa, but to the life her daughter was about to build. It was a kind of legacy, the kind of gesture that appears in elderly wisdom stories told over coffee tables and at family gatherings. A mother's love, distilled into something tangible, unforgettable. The next weekend, she invited Melissa and Daniel over for dinner. Over roast chicken and her famous peach cobbler, she made the announcement. "I'm going to cover the wedding," she said, smiling at the young couple. "Everything. The venue, the flowers, the food, even the honeymoon. I want you two to start your marriage without financial worries hanging over you." Melissa's eyes welled up, and she jumped from her seat to hug her mother. "I'll make you proud, Mom," she whispered. Daniel smiled, too, though it was a smaller, more measured expression. "That's incredibly generous, Linda. Thank you." In that moment, Linda felt a deep, quiet joy. She imagined walking Melissa down the aisle, the two of them sharing that silent, knowing look that passed between mother and daughter in milestones like this. She imagined Patricia Brooks leaning over at the reception and admitting, perhaps grudgingly, that Melissa was lucky to have such a devoted mother. She couldn't know then that the road ahead would twist in ways she never saw coming, that the love she was so eager to give would be met not with gratitude, but with something colder, sharper. That she would find herself living through one of those senior family conflict tales she had only ever overheard in hushed conversations, nodding with sympathy, but never imagining she'd be the one in the middle of it. For now, all she felt was the warmth of possibility. She threw herself into planning with the energy of someone half her age. The next few weeks became a whirlwind of meetings with vendors, tasting menus, and flipping through fabric swatches. Her little flower shop became wedding headquarters, with rolls of ribbon stacked high and sample arrangements scattered across the workbench. Customers came in and out, smiling at the bustle, offering congratulations. In quiet moments, though, Linda felt something stir. a small voice reminding her of an old lesson from her own mother. Love is a gift, but respect is the wrapping. Without the wrapping, the gift gets damaged. She brushed the thought aside. Melissa loved her. Daniel seemed fine. And Patricia, well, maybe the wedding would thaw whatever distance lay between them. One afternoon, she drove 3 hours to tour the coastal estate she'd chosen for the venue. The drive wound through forests and along cliffs where the Pacific crashed far below. Standing in the great hall, sunlight streaming through tall windows, Linda felt the certainty settle deep in her bones. "This is it," she told the event coordinator. "This is where my daughter will start her forever." Contracts were signed. Deposits paid. Every receipt neatly tucked into a labeled folder. Linda's tidy handwriting marked deadlines and to-do lists in the wedding binder she kept on the kitchen table. It wasn't just organization, it was love in motion. She imagined handing the binder to Melissa one day as a keepsake, a record of how much care went into this celebration. Looking back, Linda would later think about those early days of planning the way you think about the calm before a storm. How the air feels strangely still, the sky brighter than usual, giving no hint of the clouds gathering just beyond the horizon. She would remember the way Melissa's laughter filled the shop, the way Daniel shook her hand and called her Mom, without hesitation. And she would remember how safe she felt in believing that kindness, generosity, and sacrifice could hold a family together. In the world of elderly empowerment stories, the journey often begins in innocence, a belief that doing right by your loved ones will always be enough. Linda didn't yet know she was standing at the first page of her own chapter in that book. She only knew she was a mother, proud and hopeful, ready to give her daughter the best start she could. And in that moment, it was enough. The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be the easy part, a warm, laughter-filled prelude to the big day. It was held in a converted barn on the California coast, the kind of venue that made people sigh the moment they stepped inside. Twinkle lights crisscrossed overhead, casting a soft golden glow on the polished wood floors. The scent of rosemary and garlic drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the faint salt air that slipped in through open windows. Linda had been up before dawn, arranging the floral centerpieces herself. It wasn't because she didn't trust the hired team, she'd vetted them personally, but because she wanted her touch in every detail. Each arrangement was a careful balance of cream roses, eucalyptus, and pale blue delphiniums that mirrored the ocean outside. Guests leaned over the tables, murmuring about how beautiful everything looked. That was the kind of senior wellness story Linda liked, where her skill and care brought comfort and joy. She was smoothing the petals on one arrangement when she heard her name. The voice was clipped, polished, and carried that unmistakable edge of judgment. Patricia Brooks stood a few feet away, her designer silk blouse catching the light, a string of pearls perfectly centered at her throat. "I think it's best if we let our family make the final calls on decor," Patricia said, smiling thinly at the surrounding guests. "We wouldn't want it to look amateur." The words hung in the air like smoke. Conversations faltered. Someone coughed into their napkin. Linda froze, her hand hovering over the flowers. For a split second, she thought maybe she'd misheard. But then she caught Melissa's eye. Her daughter gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug and looked away. No defense. No gentle correction to soothe the sting. Years of keeping the peace had trained Linda to smile through moments like this. She'd done it at PTA meetings when other parents made snide remarks about her being a single mother. She'd done it at holiday dinners when her late husband's family hinted that she wasn't aspirational enough. So she pulled the familiar mask into place now, forcing a polite smile. "Of course," she said softly, stepping back from the table. Inside, something tightened. It was the faintest hairline fracture, like the first crack in a wine glass. You can barely see it, but once it's there, it's only a matter of time before the pressure makes it shatter. The evening went on, but the warmth had dimmed for Linda. She found herself drifting through conversations, her smile fixed, but her mind elsewhere. She noticed how Patricia dominated the toasts, subtly repositioning herself at the center of every photo. She noticed how Daniel laughed along with his mother's little digs at budget weddings, ironic, given that not a dime of his or Patricia's money had gone into this celebration. After dessert, guests wandered out to the terrace, where the ocean was lit by a rising moon. Linda stood near the railing, sipping a glass of sparkling water. She thought about the other family dynamics seniors had told her about, stories whispered over bridge tables or shared in quiet corners of church gatherings. Stories of being sidelined in their children's lives, of watching in-laws take center stage, of realizing too late that their role had been reduced to the one who pays. She'd always listened with sympathy, certain she'd never be in their place. Melissa had always been close to her, always called her first with big news, always sought her opinion. But now, watching her daughter laugh beside Patricia, had tilted in that deferential way, Linda felt something unfamiliar. The edge of being an outsider in a life she had helped build. Later that night, as the last guests left, Linda lingered to help the staff clear glasses and gather linens. It was muscle memory. She'd built her flower shop from nothing. She knew the rhythm of cleanup. But when she stepped back into the barn to fetch her purse, she caught the tail end of a conversation between Patricia and Melissa. "Too much of your mother's influence already," Patricia was saying, her voice low but sharp. "You want this to be your day, not hers." Melissa didn't respond immediately. When she did, it was a soft, "I know. I just don't want any drama." The words stung more than Linda wanted to admit. She left without announcing herself, her footsteps muffled by the thick rugs at the barn's entrance. Driving back to her hotel, the road winding along the dark coastline, Linda kept her eyes on the white lines flashing in her headlights. She told herself not to overreact, that weddings were stressful and people said careless things under pressure. But a part of her, the part shaped by years of observing people, of reading between the lines, knew this was more than a passing slight. In emotional senior stories, there's often a moment when the protagonist senses the ground shifting under their feet. A subtle but unmistakable change in temperature. This was Linda's moment. The crack had appeared, and though she didn't yet know how deep it ran, she could feel it widening. When she reached her hotel, Linda didn't turn on the TV or open her laptop. She sat in the quiet, listening to the ocean through the balcony door. Somewhere between the rhythmic crash of waves and the whisper of wind against the glass, she felt the first flicker of resolve. If the tide was turning, she would not be swept away without a fight. She brushed her hair, set out her dress for the next day, and slipped into bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Patricia's smile, heard Melissa's quiet "I know," and felt the weight of her own silence in response. Silence had kept the peace for decades. Silence had smoothed over arguments, softened the edges of family tension, made her the easy one to deal with. But as she lay there in the dark, Linda realized something unsettling. Peace built on silence is only peace for everyone else. For the one staying quiet, it's just surrender. She turned onto her side, staring at the sliver of moonlight cutting across the carpet. Somewhere in the distance, a buoy bell rang, soft and steady. It reminded her of the lighthouse she'd once visited with Melissa when she was a child, how the beams swept across the water, steady and unblinking, no matter how rough the sea became. Linda had always been the lighthouse. But now, she wondered if she was simply illuminating a safe path for others while standing fixed in place, weathering storms that weren't hers to endure. Morning light spilled across the coastal estate like liquid gold, catching the dew on the manicured lawns and turning it into 1,000 tiny mirrors. It should have been a perfect day. The final walkthrough was set for noon, and Linda had already arranged to meet the photographer for a last-minute shot list. She wanted every moment captured. Melissa's smile, Daniel's face when he saw her in the dress, the little details she'd obsessed over for months. She arrived early, binder in hand, and walked the grounds. The ocean's steady roar beyond the cliffs was comforting, a reminder of the permanence of certain things. Flowers lined the stone paths in full bloom, the same varieties Linda had chosen back in March. She ran her fingertips over the petals, pleased with how the colors tied together. Soft blush pinks, creamy whites, touches of sage green. Inside the main hall, the staff was setting up tables. Crisp white linens, polished silverware, crystal glasses that caught the light. It was as close to her vision as she could have hoped for. This was the gift she wanted to give her daughter. A memory wrapped in beauty, a day where everything was exactly as it should be. But perfection has a way of shattering when you least expect it. It happened that evening, after the rehearsal. Guests had started to trickle out, their laughter drifting into the night air. Linda was in the corner of the barn, carefully packing away the leftover flowers so they'd be fresh for the ceremony. She heard footsteps approach, but didn't look up until she felt the shift in the air. Melissa stood before her, still in her rehearsal dress, hair pulled back in a loose knot. Her expression was tense, eyes darting as if looking for an escape route. "Mom," she began, and Linda instantly knew something was wrong. Melissa's voice was softer than usual, almost rehearsed. "Daniel and we think it might be best if you don't come to the wedding tomorrow." The words landed with the force of a slap. Linda blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "I beg your pardon?" "It's just—" Melissa glanced over her shoulder. Daniel was standing a few feet away, hands shoved into his pockets, gaze fixed on the floor. "Things are tense. I don't want any drama. She's worried you might make things awkward." Linda's fingers tightened around the edge of the flower box. "Make things awkward? In what way?" Melissa's lips pressed into a thin line. "I just think it might be better for everyone." For a long moment, Linda simply stared at her daughter. In family dynamics seniors often speak about, there comes a moment when a child becomes unrecognizable. This was that moment for Linda. The young woman in front of her looked like Melissa, sounded like Melissa, but the warmth was gone. The bond they had shared felt like it had been quietly severed while she wasn't looking. "You're telling me," Linda said slowly, "that I should stay away from the wedding I paid for. The one I've spent a year planning. The one that's costing me $60,000. Melissa flinched, but didn't meet her eyes. "Please, Mom, don't make this harder." From behind her, Daniel spoke for the first time, his voice low. "We just want things to go smoothly." Linda turned her gaze on him. "And smooth means I disappear? That's your idea of respect." He shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Linda set the flower box down with deliberate care. "All right," she said, her voice even. "If that's what you want, I'll leave." She walked past them without waiting for a reply, her heels clicking sharply against the wood floor. Outside, the night air hit her like a wave, cool and briny. She could hear music still playing faintly inside, muffled laughter, the sound of glasses clinking. Life carrying on, as if nothing had just shifted. Her car was parked in a dark corner of the lot. She slid into the driver's seat, shut the door, and gripped the steering wheel. The binder sat on the passenger seat, its tabs neatly labeled. Venue, florist, catering, photography, entertainment. Every contract was in her name. Every deposit had been made from her account. The power of that fact pulsed in her mind. For years, Linda had believed in being the fixer, the one who smoothed over arguments, who gave more than she could afford, who stayed quiet to keep the peace. But there was no peace in this. There was only humiliation. And she could feel the sting of it settling deep, the kind of hurt that doesn't fade with time. She sat there for 20 minutes, the engine off, listening to the distant surf. Then she reached for her phone. Evelyn answered on the second ring. "Linda? What's going on?" "I want to cancel everything," Linda said. There was a pause. "Everything?" "Yes. The venue, the vendors, the band. All of it." "Linda, that's—" Evelyn hesitated. "Are you sure?" Linda's grip tightened on the phone. "If I'm not welcome, neither is my money." By the time she ended the call, Evelyn had already outlined the steps. As the legal contract holder for every vendor, Linda had the authority to pull out immediately. Cancellation fees wouldn't matter. She was willing to lose deposits rather than fund her own exclusion. Driving back to her small hotel room, Linda felt something unfamiliar blooming beneath the hurt. It wasn't peace, not yet. But it was a kind of clarity, sharp and undeniable. She'd spent decades thinking love meant endless giving. But love without respect was just charity, and she was nobody's charity case. She closed the curtains, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened the binder. Flipping through the tabs, she ran her fingers over each contract, each carefully written note. This had been her gift. And now, she would take it back. Outside, the ocean kept up its relentless rhythm, waves breaking against the shore as they had for centuries. Linda thought of the lighthouse she'd once visited with Melissa, the beam cutting through fog, steady and certain. Maybe, she thought, it was time to stop being the lighthouse for people who didn't want the light. In elderly empowerment stories, there's often a turning point, a line drawn in the sand that says, "No more." Tonight, in a small hotel room smelling faintly of salt and lavender, Linda Barrett drew hers. The next morning broke overcast, the sky a flat sheet of gray that made the Pacific look almost metallic. Linda had barely slept. She'd spent most of the night in the armchair by the window, binder open on her lap, pen in hand. Each page felt heavier than the paper it was printed on, each one a reminder that the entire wedding rested on her name, her signature, her trust. Trust that had been tossed aside as casually as an unwanted invitation. At 8 a.m., she poured herself a cup of coffee from the hotel's tiny single-serve machine, its bitterness matching the mood in her chest. She stared at her phone for a long moment before scrolling to the wedding planner's number. The line rang twice. "Hi, Linda," came the planner's chipper voice. "I was just reviewing the schedule for tomorrow. Everything's looking." "I'm canceling," Linda said flatly. There was silence, just the faint hum of background noise on the other end. "I'm sorry?" "Everything. The venue, the flowers, the catering, the music. Cancel it all." The planner's voice faltered. "Linda, that's extremely last minute. Are you certain? There will be penalties." "I'm the contract holder," Linda interrupted. "And I'm within my rights. If I'm not welcome at this wedding, neither is my money." It was the first time she'd said it out loud to anyone other than Evelyn, and the words tasted right, solid, and unshakable. The planner murmured something about needing to confirm with the vendors and hung up. Linda set the phone down, her hand steady for the first time since last night. One by one, she began making calls. The venue manager hesitated until she reminded him her name was on the agreement. The florist, a colleague she'd known for years, understood immediately, though her voice carried a note of sympathy. The caterer sighed audibly but confirmed the cancellation. The photographer, the band, the transportation service, all gone within an hour. With each call, Linda felt a small weight lift, like shedding layers of a coat she'd been wearing for too many seasons. This wasn't revenge, she reminded herself. This was preservation. This was drawing the line in a senior life transition she'd never expected to face, choosing dignity over tradition, boundaries over blind loyalty. By mid-morning, the silence in the hotel room was broken only by the low roar of the ocean beyond the balcony. Then came the knock. It was firm, not frantic, but enough to make her stomach tighten. She didn't have to look to know who it was. The voice confirmed it. "Mom, open up. We need to talk." Ryan would have knocked like that if she'd had a son. But she didn't. This was Daniel, using the same tone, the same assumption that she owed him her attention. Linda stayed still. Another knock, louder this time. "Linda, I know you're in there." She imagined him standing in the narrow hallway, his suit jacket rumpled from the drive over, his hair styled just so, the image of a man who thought charm could smooth over anything. But charm had no place here. The knocking stopped. A few seconds later, her phone lit up with his name. She let it go to voicemail. A moment later, a text arrived. "You can't do this. It's our wedding." Linda almost laughed. Our wedding? No, she thought. It had been hers, from the first deposit to the last vendor call. And if she wasn't welcome, it no longer existed. The phone buzzed again. This time it was Melissa. Against her better judgment, Linda answered. "Mom, what the hell are you doing?" Melissa's voice was tight, teetering between anger and panic. "You can't just cancel everything. People are expecting." "Stop," Linda said quietly. "You stood there last night and let her humiliate me in front of everyone. You didn't say a word." "I didn't want to make a scene, but it was fine for her to make one," Linda replied. There was a pause on the line. "Emma, Melissa began, then stopped. Patricia was upset.
She didn't mean it like that.
You mean she didn't mean for me to take it seriously? Linda's tone sharpened. I paid for everything, Melissa. The venue, the food, the music, all of it. And you let her treat me like I was in the way. It's our wedding, Melissa repeated, voice rising. It was my gift, Linda corrected. And now it's gone. The silence stretched. In the background, Linda thought she heard Daniel's voice, low and urgent, feeding lines. She felt no need to stay on the call. She's in tears right now. Melissa tried again, her voice softer. She should have thought about that before she told me not to come, Linda said. When she hung up, the room felt calmer. There was still a dull ache in her chest, but beneath it was something steadier. A resolve she recognized from other elderly empowerment stories she'd heard in her circles. Stories of women who finally said enough after decades of being the fixer, the giver, the one who bent so others could stand taller. Linda had always thought of those women as brave. Now, she realized bravery wasn't some grand, cinematic gesture. Sometimes it was just keeping the door closed when someone knocked. Sometimes it was pressing end call instead of explaining yourself one more time. She closed the binder and slid it into her bag. There was nothing left to plan. The wedding, as she had built it, was over. Outside, the clouds began to break, slivers of sunlight piercing through to the water. Linda stepped onto the balcony, inhaling the salt air. The sea looked different now, not just vast and powerful, but cleansing. The kind of force that strips away what doesn't belong and leaves you with something raw, honest, and unshakable. For years, she'd told herself that keeping the peace meant staying silent. But silence had bought her no peace at all. Only this, a moment of clarity on a windswept balcony, knowing that her story was shifting into a chapter she hadn't planned, but one she would own completely. By late afternoon, Linda's phone had become a constant vibration in her purse. Calls, texts, notifications, a stream of demands, accusations, and feigned concern. It was almost amusing how quickly the tone shifted. The same people who had quietly accepted Patricia's insult last night now spoke to her as though she were the one who had caused a public scene. The first message came from Patricia, of course. You've ruined everything. This is unforgivable. No greeting, no attempt at civility, just a blunt swing, as if Linda had been nothing more than a tool gone faulty. Then Melissa. The first call was tearful, pleading. The second was sharp-edged, her words clipped. You don't understand what this is doing to us. Guests are flying in. Deposits. Linda hung up before she could finish. Daniel followed, his voice more controlled, but with the unmistakable undertone of anger. You've put us in an impossible position. We can't fix this in time. Linda leaned back at her chair, the phone on speaker, and let the silence stretch before she spoke. Then perhaps you should have considered the consequences before you told me I wasn't welcome. There was a pause. It's not like that. It's exactly like that, she said, and ended the call. But the real gut punch didn't come until an email notification slid across her screen. American Express. Thank you for your recent purchase. Linda frowned, clicking it open. The first line made her stomach clench. 14-night Caribbean cruise package, $18,500, charged to your account ending in 5921. She scrolled down. There was a note. Guests, Melissa Barrett and Daniel Brooks. The booking date was 3 weeks ago, right in the middle of the wedding planning rush, when Melissa had been asking Linda for her opinion on floral colors. A second email followed within minutes. Louis Vuitton, bridal luggage set, $4,200. Same card, same date. Linda set the laptop aside and pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes. It wasn't just the betrayal of last night. This was theft, plain and simple. They had taken her generosity for granted, not just for the wedding, but for every luxury they thought they deserved afterward. They had looked at her and seen an open wallet, not a mother. She picked up the phone and dialed Evelyn. Linda, her friend said without preamble. I was about to call you. How are you holding up? I just got 2 charges on my card, Linda said, her voice steady despite the cold not forming in her chest. A cruise and a luggage set. both in their names. Booked weeks ago. Evelyn's voice hardened. Did you authorize it? Of course not. Then we'll add it to the list, Evelyn replied. Unauthorized use of funds. I'll draft a letter tonight. Within the hour, Evelyn had emailed her a formal cease and desist notice, harassment, defamation, and unauthorized financial activity all laid out in crisp legal language. Linda printed it on the hotel's business center printer, the warm paper sliding into her hands like a tangible piece of armor. Her phone rang again. This time, the caller ID read Patricia Brooks. Against her better judgment, Linda answered. You've gone too far. Patricia's voice was sharp, the veneer of politeness gone. Melissa is devastated. Daniel is trying to salvage what's left, but you've embarrassed all of us. Linda let her speak, waited until she paused for breath, then said, Patricia, you told me, in front of dozens of people, that I wasn't welcome at the wedding I paid for. That was your choice. Canceling the wedding was mine. You're destroying your daughter's future. No, Linda said evenly. I'm forcing her to take responsibility for it. The line went quiet for a beat, then Patricia snapped, You'll regret this, before hanging up. Linda stared at the phone for a moment, then set it face down on the desk. She didn't feel regret. She felt lighter. Not happy, not yet, but relieved in a way she couldn't quite explain. For the first time in years, she was acting in her own defense, not just absorbing the blows for the sake of keeping the peace. By evening, the social media storm had begun. A post appeared on Melissa's Instagram, a photo of her and Daniel holding hands, the caption reading, We will not let hate win. Family is who supports you, not who tears you down. The comments flooded in, friends and acquaintances offering sympathy, casting Linda as the villain without knowing a single fact. Linda didn't respond. She knew the truth had a way of surfacing, and when it did, it would be loud enough without her voice added to it. In elderly wisdom stories, the ones that linger, the turning point isn't when the elder shouts the loudest, it's when they refuse to shout at all, letting actions speak for them. Still, she documented everything. Screenshots of the posts, the comments, the likes from people she'd once welcomed into her home. She saved them into a folder on her laptop labeled simply, for Evelyn. The night ended with a final call from Melissa. Her voice was quiet now, almost measured. Mom, can we just fix this? Please? For me. Linda paused, imagining the girl Melissa had once been. The one who came home crying from school and curled up in her lap until the storm passed. But that girl was gone. Melissa, she said softly, you made a choice last night. And now I'm making mine. There was no yelling, no slammed phones. Just silence, and then the soft click of the call ending. Linda closed her laptop, drew the curtains, and sat in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. This was not how she had pictured the days before her daughter's wedding. But life, she thought, had a way of writing its own chapters. And sometimes, those chapters became the elderly empowerment stories that others would tell, shaking their heads at the audacity of someone finally standing up for themselves. Tomorrow, she would meet Evelyn in person to go over the next steps. But tonight, she let the quiet settle around her, the sound of the ocean through the cracked window like a lullaby. For the first time in a long time, she felt no need to apologize for protecting her own dignity. The next morning, the coastal fog hung low, rolling in from the Pacific like a slow-moving tide determined to smother the shoreline. Linda sat at a small table in a downtown cafe, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she hadn't touched. Across from her, Evelyn Carter looked every bit the attorney Linda had relied on for the past 2 decades, tailored blazer, hair pulled into a neat twist, eyes sharp but steady. All right, Evelyn said, flipping open a folder thick with printed contracts and documents. I've reviewed every agreement you signed for the wedding. They're all airtight. Your name is the sole contract holder. If Melissa and Daniel want to proceed with their plans, they'll have to start from scratch, pay their own deposits, sign their own contracts, negotiate their own terms. Linda nodded, her fingers tightening on the mug. Good. Evelyn leaned forward. There's more. The charges on your credit card? We can file a formal dispute. Unauthorized use of funds, potentially criminal if you want to push it. I do, Linda said, her voice steady. She could hear the steel in it now, the same kind she'd admired in other women when they told their own elderly empowerment stories. It was the sound of someone who had stopped asking for permission to protect herself. Evelyn slid another paper across the table.
Cease and desist.
Harassment, defamation, unauthorized use of funds. This goes to Melissa, Daniel, and Patricia. Certified mail. No wiggle room. Linda picked up the pen and signed. Her hand didn't shake. When she looked up, Evelyn was studying her. You're sure about this? Linda exhaled slowly. I've spent my whole life making sure other people were comfortable. I've bitten my tongue more times than I can count. But this, she gestured toward the papers, this is mine to do. The cafe door swung open, and a gust of damp air followed a man inside. For a moment, Linda thought nothing of it until she saw him pause, scanning the room. Daniel Brooks spotted her, his expression tight, and strode over. Linda, he said, not even glancing at Evelyn. We need to talk. Evelyn's voice was calm, almost pleasant. You're interrupting a legal meeting. If you have something to say, I suggest you put it in writing. Daniel ignored her, turning his attention to Linda. Melissa is falling apart. She hasn't slept. We can work this out if you just stop all of this. Linda held his gaze. Work it out how? Pretend last night didn't happen? Pretend you didn't stand there and let your mother humiliate me? You're blowing it out of proportion, Daniel said, lowering his voice as other customers glanced their way. Patricia was upset. She told me not to come to my own daughter's wedding, Linda interrupted. That's not upset, Daniel. That's disrespect. Daniel's jaw tightened. You're hurting Melissa. Linda leaned back in her chair. No, Daniel. Melissa hurt herself when she chose to side with someone who treats her mother like an inconvenience. Evelyn closed her folder with a crisp snap. This conversation is over, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. If you contact my client directly again, we'll add it to the harassment file. Daniel's eyes flicked between them before he turned and walked out, shoulders stiff. When the door shut behind him, Evelyn looked at Linda. You handled that well. Linda almost smiled. I didn't raise my voice once. Back at the hotel, Linda took the next step. She called her bank to freeze the joint account she'd opened for Melissa years ago, back when her daughter was in college and needed a safety net. It had been her way of saying, I'll always be here for you. But that promise no longer meant what it once did. The banker on the other end hesitated. Are you sure, Ms. Barrett? This will cut off access immediately. I'm sure, Linda said. When she hung up, she sat in the quiet, listening to the faint hum of the mini fridge. There was a finality to the silence, like a door clicking shut in a house she'd already moved out of. That afternoon, Patricia called again. Linda let it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of her. The message was as predictable as it was venomous. You've made a fool of yourself, Patricia's voice hissed through the speaker. The entire family thinks you're unstable. I don't know how you expect to have any relationship with Melissa after this. Linda deleted it without saving. If Patricia thought shame was a weapon, she'd clearly forgotten that shame only works if you still care what the other person thinks. In the evening, Linda took a walk along the beach. The tide was out, leaving ripples in the wet sand that caught the fading light. Couples strolled past, some barefoot, some with jackets, zipped against the chill. She watched a small child run ahead of his parents, his laughter carried on the wind, and felt a pang she couldn't quite name. Love for Melissa was still there, buried under layers of hurt and disappointment. But love without respect, she knew now, wasn't enough. She thought about other emotional senior stories she'd heard in her women's group, tales of parents cut off from grandchildren, siblings who stopped speaking over wills, friends abandoned when money was no longer flowing. The details changed, but the core was always the same. Someone gave more than they could afford, and the other person took it as a right, not a gift. When she returned to the hotel, Evelyn had emailed confirmation that the cease and desist letters had been sent. They'll arrive tomorrow, the note read. After that, if they keep pushing, we escalate. Linda closed the laptop and poured herself a glass of water. Tomorrow, the paper trail would begin, the first steps in making sure this wasn't just a momentary stand, but a lasting one. She wasn't naive enough to think it would fix everything, but it would protect her, and that was enough. She stood by the window, watching the last light fade over the water. The horizon was a thin line between sea and sky, barely visible in the dimming glow. For years, she'd thought her role was to keep everyone else from drifting too far. Tonight, she realized she was the one who needed to keep herself from being pulled under. In senior life transitions, there's a point where you stop measuring your worth by what you give away and start measuring it by what you keep for yourself. Linda had just crossed that point, and there was no going back. The first whispers started less than 48 hours after the cancellations. At first, Linda assumed they were just fallout from Melissa's Instagram post, that vague, tear-stained selfie with a caption about family tearing you down. She'd seen it because a neighbor from her hometown, one of the few people Linda still followed on social media, had sent her a screenshot along with a terse message. What happened? Linda didn't reply. She'd promised herself she wouldn't get pulled into online brawls. She'd seen enough family dynamics seniors end badly when private fights went public. But she did open the post, scrolling through comments from people she hadn't seen in years. Some were sympathetic. Others, people Linda had once welcomed into her home, sided openly with Melissa and Daniel. Cut her off. You don't need toxic energy on your wedding day. So sorry you're dealing with this, Melissa. Stay strong. Linda let the screen go dark. She wasn't going to win hearts by debating strangers. But she also knew something they didn't. The truth had a way of leaking out, especially when other people started putting the pieces together. It began with a single comment under the post. Didn't her mom pay for the whole thing, though? No likes at first, but within hours, another user chimed in. My cousin works at the venue. Everything was in Linda's name. Melissa and Daniel didn't pay a dime. Linda didn't engage, but she bookmarked the thread. By the next day, the comment section had shifted tone. Someone else wrote, imagine kicking out the person funding your wedding. The replies were sharper now. That's cold. Ungrateful much? Wow, if true, that's beyond messed up. Screenshots started circulating in a private Facebook group for local brides-to-be. Linda knew about it because one of her former customers sent her a message. Just so, people are talking. And not in the way Melissa wants. The screenshots showed email confirmations, the very same bookings Linda had made for the venue, the band, the florist, even the honeymoon. How they'd gotten out, Linda didn't know. Maybe a vendor who'd had enough. Maybe someone on the inside who believed she deserved the benefit of the doubt. By the end of the week, Melissa's social media had gone quieter. The flood of sympathy posts slowed. A few were deleted entirely. Linda didn't take satisfaction in it, not exactly. But she felt a small, measured relief that the narrative was no longer entirely one-sided. One afternoon, while she was sitting on the hotel balcony with a cup of tea, her phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number. Against her better judgment, she answered. Linda? It's Karen Harper, the voice said. You probably don't remember me. My daughter used to work with Melissa at the boutique. Linda vaguely recalled the name. Yes, hi. I just wanted to say, I've heard what happened. And I wanted you to know you're not the villain here. People are starting to understand. Linda swallowed. Thank you. Karen's voice softened. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I've been in your shoes. My son's wedding, similar story. Sometimes you have to let them fall without you catching them. After they hung up, Linda sat for a long time, staring at the horizon. She thought about all the emotional senior stories she'd heard over the years, each one a quiet testament to resilience. Those stories had always felt distant before, like cautionary tales that happened to other people. Now, she was living one. By the weekend, even some of Melissa's closer friends had stopped defending her publicly. The tone shifted from outrage on her behalf to carefully worded posts about complicated family matters. One mutual friend even wrote, sometimes the version of the story you hear first isn't the whole story. Linda didn't post anything herself. She didn't need to. Silence was its own kind of statement now. But she kept documenting screenshots, forwarded messages, timestamps. Evelyn had told her to keep a clean record in case the harassment continued. Meanwhile, Patricia had gone conspicuously quiet. No more voicemails, no more snide texts. Linda suspected it was because the cease and desist letter had arrived. Evelyn had confirmed it had been signed for. Still, Linda wasn't naive. She knew how quickly public opinion could swing. The same people who were now questioning Melissa's side of the story could turn back in an instant if they thought Linda was being petty. That was why she didn't engage, didn't gloat, didn't offer her own tell-all post. The truth was doing its work without her help. One evening, she took a walk along the boardwalk, the sea air cool against her face. A middle-aged woman passed by, slowed, and turned back. "Are you Linda Barrett?" Linda hesitated. "Yes." The woman smiled. "Good for you," she said simply, then kept walking. Linda stood there for a moment, surprised at the rush of warmth those 3 words brought. Good for you. Not "I'm sorry" or "what happened." Just acknowledgement. It reminded her that this wasn't just her fight. It was one more entry in the long, unspoken ledger of elderly wisdom stories that older women carried between them like heirlooms. Stories of setting boundaries when the people you love most cross lines they can't uncross. Back at the hotel, she found an email from Evelyn waiting. It was short. "Vendors are talking. Your reputation's intact. If anything, it's stronger now." Linda smiled faintly. She thought about her little flower shop back home, about the regular customers who'd probably already heard their own version of the gossip. She knew some would believe Melissa. Others would side with her. But the people who mattered, the ones who knew her character, would see this for what it was. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Linda leaned on the balcony railing, feeling the cool metal beneath her palms. For the first time in weeks, the weight in her chest felt lighter. Not gone, but lighter. She still didn't know what her relationship with Melissa would look like after this, or if there would even be one. But she knew one thing for certain. She'd protected herself, her dignity, and her peace. And no public opinion could take that away. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and warm, the kind of June day that photographers dream of: flawless light, a gentle breeze, the scent of salt in the air. Linda woke early. Not to rush into hair appointments or shuttle between venues, but because the sun streamed through the curtains of her seaside hotel room. She lay there for a few moments, listening to the soft hush of the waves. It took her a second to remember what day it was. And then, instead of a twist of regret, there was something else, a quiet, settled calm. This was the day she'd spent months planning, the day she'd poured her savings into. And now, it belonged to someone else entirely. The venue had rebooked after her cancellation. Another couple would be walking those manicured lawns, saying their vows under the arch she had once imagined for Melissa. Linda padded to the balcony in her robe, cradling a cup of coffee. The view stretched endlessly, the Pacific a deep, shimmering blue under the morning sun. She thought about where she would have been right now if things had gone differently. Likely at the bridal suite, helping Melissa with the buttons on her dress, making sure Patricia's requests didn't interfere with the florist's arrangements. She pictured the noise, the tension disguised as celebration. Instead, she was here, the air filled only with gulls calling and waves breaking. She'd booked herself a spa appointment for noon, a massage, and a long soak in the eucalyptus steam room. A small luxury she'd never taken on the wedding day of someone else. At 10:15 a.m., her phone pinged with a notification from a number she didn't recognize. "Today's the day. Can't wait to see you both at 2 p.m. Clearly, a guest who hadn't been informed of the implosion. Linda didn't reply. She simply set the phone down, letting the message sit unread. She imagined the scene at the estate now, staff setting out chairs, musicians tuning instruments. But instead of Melissa and Daniel, it would be strangers in those roles, smiling for their own photographs, creating their own memories. There was something poetic about it, in a way. The space had moved on just as she had. By noon, Linda was stretched out on a chaise lounge at the spa, a warm towel draped across her shoulders, a glass of champagne sweating gently on the side table. She let her mind drift. When the clock ticked toward 2, She pictured the new couple's vows being exchanged under the same arch she'd chosen, the same ocean breeze carrying their words away. It didn't sting. It didn't even feel bittersweet. It felt clean, like the tide washing away footprints in the sand. Later, back in her room, she posted a photo to her private social media, the ocean from her balcony, a champagne flute in the corner of the frame. The caption was short, "Best decision I ever made." No tags, no names. But she knew word would travel. Melissa would see it, and so would Patricia. And they'd understand exactly what she meant. By early evening, the sky blushed pink over the water. Linda ordered room service, grilled halibut with lemon butter, a side of roasted vegetables, and ate on the balcony, the air cooling against her skin. Somewhere down the coast, the reception would be in full swing for the other couple. Glasses clinking, music spilling out into the night. Linda imagined how different that energy must be from the tense, fractured event Melissa and Daniel had been scrambling to piece together. The truth was, she didn't know what they'd ended up doing instead. A scaled-down ceremony? A courthouse, signing followed by dinner at a local restaurant? It didn't matter. That chapter was no longer hers to oversee. She'd closed the book the night she made those cancellation calls. As darkness fell, Linda lit the small candle she'd bought in town, lavender and cedarwood, and set it by the bed. The scent reminded her of home, of evenings in her own kitchen with the kettle on and a crossword puzzle spread out on the table. She realized she was looking forward to getting back there, to her flower shop, her garden, her life that wasn't dictated by someone else's demands. She thought about the women she'd met in her community center's book club, many of them sharing their own elderly wisdom stories over tea. Tales of standing up to grown children, of walking away from relationships that had turned toxic, of discovering that peace was worth more than proximity. This, she realized, was now her own story to tell. Not just about loss, but about choosing herself when it mattered most. That night, she slept deeply, without the anxious dreams that had haunted her in the weeks before. In the morning, she didn't check social media, didn't scan for updates or whispers about how the day had gone for Melissa and Daniel. Instead, she took a long walk along the beach, letting the water lap at her ankles. The horizon stretched wide and open ahead of her, the early sun scattering light across the waves. It occurred to her that she felt lighter not because the conflict had been resolved, it hadn't, but because she had stepped out of the storm entirely. She'd removed herself from the chaos, and in doing so, had found the quiet she'd been craving for years. There would be hard days ahead. Rebuilding boundaries with Melissa, if that was even possible. Navigating the opinions of relatives who thought they knew the full story. But for now, Linda let herself breathe in the salt air and believe in the power of her own choice. She wasn't the villain in this story, no matter how others tried to cast her. She wasn't the victim, either. She was the author, writing the next chapter on her own terms. In the days following the wedding that wasn't, the Pacific Northwest summer rolled on as if nothing monumental had shifted in Linda Barrett's world. But for Linda, everything felt different. She woke in her own rhythm now, without the barrage of early morning texts or last-minute vendor calls. The silence was no longer oppressive, it was restorative. Back home in Oregon, her flower shop greeted her with the scent of fresh-cut lilies and the low hum of the cooler. Her assistant, Marcy, smiled when she walked in. "Welcome back," she said, as if Linda had only been away for a weekend, not embroiled in one of the more infamous family dynamic seniors in their community had ever whispered about. Linda could feel the shift in the air, the way some customers lingered a little longer than usual, clearly hoping she might bring up the subject. She didn't. She rang up their purchases, offered her usual warm but measured conversation, and let them leave with their own versions of the story. Word had traveled fast. In the age of social media, even the smallest spark of gossip could catch fire. And this was a bonfire. By now, people knew at least part of the truth, that Linda had paid for the entire event, that she'd been asked not to attend, and that she'd pulled the plug. The details varied depending on who was telling it, but the central fact was clear. Linda had drawn a line. Melissa hadn't called. Not once. The last communication had been that half-hearted plea before the wedding to fix things, followed by a curt text the day after. "I hope you're happy. You've ruined everything." Linda read it once, then deleted it. She'd already spent too many years interpreting Melissa's words through the lens of a mother's unconditional love.
It was time to take them at face value.
Patricia, predictably, had stayed silent since receiving Evelyn's letter. No more voice messages, no attempts at back-channel diplomacy. Linda suspected she'd shifted her focus to damage control within her own circle, painting herself as the dignified matriarch dealing with a difficult in-law. That was fine. People like Patricia always needed a narrative in which they were the hero. But the ripples of the story kept spreading in ways Linda hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, while she was restocking vases, the bell over the shop door jingled. In walked a woman Linda didn't recognize, mid-50s, short auburn hair, carrying a leather tote. "Are you Linda Barrett?" she asked. Linda nodded cautiously. "I just wanted to tell you," the woman said. "You did the right thing. My sister went through something similar last year. Paid for her son's wedding, then got treated like an afterthought. She didn't say a word, just sat there and took it. Still regrets it. You stood up for yourself." It was happening more often now, strangers or acquaintances stepping forward with their own elderly empowerment stories. Tales of checks written and respect withheld, of years of giving met with a single act of erasure. Some spoke in hushed tones, as if confessing a shameful secret, others with open admiration. Linda listened, nodded, and thanked them. She didn't need validation to know she'd done what was necessary, but she also recognized the quiet solidarity in their words. It reminded her that her decision, while deeply personal, was part of a larger pattern, one that too many seniors endured in silence. Meanwhile, online chatter had shifted again. A local wedding forum posted an anonymous cautionary tale, eerily similar to Linda's experience. The comments were swift and unfiltered. "If you can't afford your own wedding, don't bite the hand that feeds you." This is entitlement at its worst. Good for her. Boundaries are important, even with family. Linda didn't engage, but she read every comment. Not for vindication, but to remind herself that she wasn't crazy, that respect was not an unreasonable expectation. One evening, she received a call from her sister-in-law, Janine. "I just want to say," Janine began, "I didn't realize the whole picture. I'm sorry I doubted you." Linda appreciated the apology, but kept her response simple. "Thank you, Janine." There was a pause. "Do you think you and Melissa will ever?" "I don't know," Linda admitted. "That's up to her." After they hung up, Linda thought about what reconciliation would even look like. It couldn't be the same as before. Trust, once cracked, never returned to its original shape. In senior life transitions, rebuilding after betrayal often meant accepting that the relationship would be different, sometimes smaller, sometimes more distant, but no longer built on the same foundation. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the late summer light fade over her garden. The hydrangeas were in full bloom, their blue petals catching the last of the sun. She found comfort in their steady cycle, pruning, growth, bloom, rest. People could learn a lot from flowers, she thought, especially about knowing when to let go. By the end of August, the story had lost some of its heat. New scandals, new gossip had replaced it in the community's attention. But the ripples were still there, subtle but lasting. Linda noticed she was invited into certain conversations differently now, with a kind of cautious respect. Not the patronizing sympathy often handed to older women, but genuine regard for someone who had made a hard choice and stuck to it. And in quieter moments, she noticed something else. She was sleeping better. The knot of tension that had lived in her shoulders for years had eased. She laughed more easily with Marcy at the shop, lingered longer over books in the evenings, took weekend drives just because the weather was nice. These were the dividends of her decision. Not flashy, not dramatic, but steady and real. The relationship with Melissa might never be repaired. That was a truth Linda was learning to live with. But she also knew she had given her daughter something she might not recognize for years, an example. An inspirational senior story, not about revenge, but about self-respect. About refusing to fund your own humiliation. about showing that love has limits, and those limits matter. As September approached, Linda began planning her annual autumn display for the shop. Pumpkins, mums, deep red dahlias. Life was moving forward, and so was she. By the time autumn rolled in, the Pacific Northwest air had sharpened, carrying the scent of wet leaves and chimney smoke. In Linda Barrett's flower shop, the display window glowed with a rich tapestry of seasonal blooms, deep burgundy dahlias, golden mums, and the warm orange of sugar pumpkins. It was her favorite time of year, when the rush of summer weddings gave way to slower, more deliberate arrangements. Life had settled into a new rhythm. The chaos of June felt like a distant storm, the kind you remember more for the way it changed the landscape than for the violence of the wind. Customers still asked gentle, probing questions about how things turned out, but Linda had perfected her answer. A small smile, a shift of topic. The story was no longer hers to retell in whispers. It had become part of the quiet ledger of lessons she carried with her. Melissa had not called. A few short texts had arrived in late July, stiff, transactional messages about retrieving some items left at Linda's house, but nothing more. Linda responded politely, arranging for the pickup, but didn't push for conversation. It wasn't coldness. It was acceptance. In the realm of senior life transitions, she had learned that not every chapter needed a neat resolution. Some simply ended. What had surprised her was the absence of bitterness. She thought she'd carry anger for a long time, maybe forever. But as the weeks passed, anger gave way to something steadier, clarity. She could look back without flinching now, recognizing the warning signs she'd ignored, the boundaries she'd let blur. Not to blame herself, but to understand. One rainy Thursday, she stayed late at the shop, rearranging the front display. Outside, the street lamps reflected off the wet pavement, and the steady patter of rain against the windows made the whole place feel cocooned. She paused to make herself a cup of tea, the steam curling into the air. It struck her then how different her evenings felt. She no longer braced herself for the chime of a text asking for more money, for another urgent request that wasn't hers to solve. The space in her life, once taken up by constant giving, and constant being taken for granted, had been filled with small joys. Time for a book she'd been meaning to read. A weekend trip to the coast just because the weather was good. Long phone calls with friends who asked how she was, not what she could do for them. She thought about the other women she'd met over the years, at the community center, in her book club, customers who lingered in the shop, and how many had their own elderly empowerment stories hidden just under the surface. Stories of sons, daughters, siblings, or even lifelong friends who had crossed a line.
Some had pushed back.
Others hadn't. But every one of them had understood the cost of silence. Linda had been silent for a long time. She told herself it was grace, or patience, or love. And maybe, in part, it was. But she could see now that it was also fear. Fear of being cut off. Fear of conflict. Fear of being seen as difficult. In the end, she realized, none of those fears had protected her. They had only delayed the moment she finally said enough. One evening in early October, she was closing up the shop when a young woman came in, clearly in a hurry. She asked for a bouquet, something bright but elegant. As Linda wrapped the flowers, the woman hesitated. "You're Linda Barrett, right?" she asked. Linda nodded. "My aunt told me what happened with your daughter. She said you inspire her to finally say no to my cousin. He's been taking advantage of her for years. She told me, if Linda can stand her ground, so can I." Linda felt the words settle somewhere deep inside her. "I'm glad she's looking out for herself," she said simply. When the young woman left, bouquet in hand, Linda locked the door and stood for a moment in the stillness. Outside, the last light was fading, the street empty except for a lone car parked under a maple whose leaves had turned to fire. It wasn't fame or vindication she felt. It was something quieter, but more enduring, the knowledge that her choice had mattered. Not just to her, but to someone else who had needed to see that it could be done. In inspirational senior stories, the lesson is rarely about the specific fight. It's about what the fight teaches you, about yourself, about the people around you, about the value of your own peace. Linda's lesson was simple, but hard-earned. Love freely, but protect your dignity. Give generously, but not at the cost of your self-respect. And understand that walking away isn't failure. Sometimes, it's the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for the person who needs to face the consequences of their choices. That night, at home, Linda made herself a simple dinner: roasted chicken, green beans from her garden, a baked potato. She ate slowly, savoring the quiet. Afterward, she stepped outside with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and sat on the back porch. The air was crisp, the stars sharp against the dark sky. She thought about Melissa, the little girl she'd once read bedtime stories to, the teenager who had whispered secrets into the dark on late-night drives home, the young woman who had, for reasons Linda still didn't fully understand, chosen to believe that respect was optional when it came to her mother. She hoped that one day, Melissa would see things differently, that she'd understand the gift she'd been given, not in dollars, but in the example of a woman who refused to let love be used as currency. And if that day never came, Linda would still be all right. She had her shop, her friends, her garden, her independence. She had her peace. As the night air wrapped around her, Linda smiled faintly. She wasn't a lighthouse anymore, standing fixed while others navigated by her light. She was the ship now, charting her own course, away from rocky shores and toward open water. Being alone was not the same as being lonely, and being at peace was not the same as being untouched by pain. It was deeper than that, a knowing that she had faced a choice between losing herself or losing someone else, and she had chosen herself. That was her wisdom. That was her story. And in the long tradition of elderly wisdom stories, it was one worth telling. In life, there comes a time when we must choose between keeping the peace and keeping our self-respect. Linda's story reminds us that love, while powerful, should never come at the cost of our dignity. Boundaries are not walls that shut people out. They are doors that define how we let people in. As we age, our worth isn't measured by how much we give or sacrifice, but by how much we honor ourselves in the process. For many seniors, the hardest step is realizing that walking away from toxic dynamics is not an act of selfishness. It's an act of self-preservation. True relationships are built on mutual respect, and when that respect is missing, distance can be the most loving choice you make for both sides. This is one of those elderly wisdom stories that teaches us the beauty of standing tall in our truth. May we all have the courage to protect our peace, even when it's hard, and the wisdom to know that our value does not depend on the approval of others. Thank you for watching the video. Please comment with number 1 to let me know you have watched the whole video. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell to always receive new videos as soon as possible.